Says the U.S. and NATO are ignoring his country's central concerns, namely the possibility, though let's be clear, not an imminent possibility, of NATO expansion. Putin discussed that in a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron today. The head of NATO says the organization is fully prepared, whatever should come.
From the NATO side, we are ready to engage in political dialogue, but we're also ready to respond if Russia chooses an armed conflict, confrontation. So we are ready for both options. We are working hard for the best, peaceful political solution, but we're also prepared for the worst.
NATO and the United States are still waiting to get an answer from President Putin after responding to Russia's demands as requested in writing. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging calm, warning the West that panic helps no one. Kerry Buck was Canada's ambassador to NATO between 2015 and 2018. She is currently a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Ms. Buck, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Let me start with that meeting between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin via video, of course. From a tactical standpoint, do you think it was smart for Macron to have this one-on-one with Mr. Putin at this stage?
Across European partners, there is a lot of work going on right now, a lot of work going on to make sure that everyone's messaging is aligned. Messaging is aligned in terms of response to the threats that Vladimir Putin is making, and that actions are aligned in terms of bolstering Eastern allies who are feeling increasingly nervous and aligning sanctions. So the short answer is no, I don't think so. I think that multiple strands of negotiations are to be expected. It's what's happened consistently since 2014. I was the political director in 2014 when Russia marched into Crimea. And I have to say that the alliance solidarity has been pretty unshakable since that time.
Knowing what you know, Ms. Buck, what do you think, what is Putin's next play?
Well, let me first say what they're doing and what they're saying, but that might be different from what Vladimir Putin's intent is. Ukraine is both a target and a source of leverage for them. Mm-hmm. So as you know, they've amassed 100K plus troops on borders, but they're also targeting political stability in Ukraine. But it's very clear, too, that the threats have gone beyond seeking to close NATO's open door or taking more territory in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians have even gone out and started to raise questions about U.S. bases in Japan, U.S. role in Asia Pacific, threatening hypersonic missiles in Cuba, and then put on the table some draft treaties. Their proposals to the U.S. and to NATO, which include demands that NATO have no troops in NATO allies, Poland and the Baltics, for instance. So basically trying to roll back European security architecture back to 1997. I think the bottom line is that no one knows. Maybe Mr. Putin's made a decision whether he'll invade Ukraine, maybe not. But we do know that he's creating a situation where he could if he wanted to. It's not even clear that Minister Lavrov or his chief negotiators know what the intent is. It could be threatening the entire European security architecture, could be evicting the US from Europe. But we do know that they're exploiting every potential fracture.
In terms of timing, you know, of course, U.S. President Joe Biden took over from Trump. Germany's long-serving Chancellor Angela Merkel is also gone. Do you think that's playing into this timing, that Mr. Putin is perhaps sensing some weakness there?
I think absolutely you're right. I think that he is looking at perceived gaps between NATO and the EU, perceived weakening of the U.S. writ large after President Trump. Rivalries inside Europe and the new German government in the absence of Angela Merkel. But I also think there's a perverse result in that he's actually strengthening the unity among Western allies rather than weakening it. That being said, the key thing for US, Canada, European allies to do right now is to maintain that rock solid unity of purpose, unity of messaging, unity of action.
What do you think Ukraine's next move might be?
Ukraine has gone through a tremendous evolution and growth since 2014. Well, before that, of course, with its increasing, when it came out from under the umbrella of the Soviet Union and started to build their democracy, build their economy. But 2014 was a very dangerous time for them, of course, with Russia going into not just Crimea, but there's been a hot war in eastern Ukraine since that time. But Ukraine has really stood up, honestly, with a lot of support from Canada and others. Building not just their military capacity, but also their resilience in terms of their democratic institutions, police, media, etc. There's a long way to go still, absolutely. But I have to say that, Russia has what we call escalation dominance. So if Vladimir Putin were to decide to go into Ukraine, he would absolutely have the military upper hand. But it would be unwise, I think, to assume that Ukraine wouldn't offer a very, very healthy fight. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important that the messaging on sanctions and the absolute gravity of the response that Vladimir Putin will face if he decides to move into Ukraine further. I think that's really, really an important deterrence message.
Do you think that they haven't been united enough? Is that what you're hinting at?
No, not at all. I think they have been united enough. I don't know. I mean, I'm not inside anymore, but based on what I saw happen when we aligned our sanctions, Canadian sanctions, US sanctions, European sanctions, in response to their moves in Crimea and the Donbass, I would expect that there'll be a very clear and firm message to Russia in the event that those sanctions need to be unleashed. And that's certainly been the messaging from the U.S. administration.
The former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, is telling Politico in an interview that if an invasion were to go ahead, and he believes it is likely, but in the southeast and maybe a few fronts in the north, that he tries to take more territory quickly and then yields to a new ceasefire. Is that the kind of strategy you see playing out?
Honestly, I call it Putinology, and I've been in many, many head of state discussions since 2014, trying to ascertain what Mr. Putin is going to do. He's certainly set up the troop presence and some of the supply lines and some of the capabilities he needs to move in. But he's done it very much out in the open. It's different from 2014. So part of it is, seeing what the West will do. So I don't think it's a given that he'll move in, but he could move in. And Kurt knows this. He's been working on the file longer, even longer than I have, if that's possible.
In terms of Canada's response, what it has offered so far, I wanted to get your take on that and also how it compares to 2014.
Canada has been, since 2014, firmly in the top tier of the alliance, I think, in terms of support to Ukraine, but also bolstering the NATO presence in the eastern members of the alliance. Canadian contribution also has been focused, I said this a minute ago, on building resilience in the democratic institutions in Ukraine, which is really important because Russia's been using what we call gray zone tactics or hybrid tactics to try and undermine those democratic building blocks in Ukraine. So I was ambassador to NATO when we established Canada's leadership of the battle group in Latvia. And at the time, Jens Stoltenberg said to me that he could not overstate the importance to the alliance of Canada stepping up to lead that battle group. And I expect to see more NATO activity to ramp up the presence of allies in eastern countries of the alliance.
Just really quickly before we let you go, we have gone over time, but I did want to ask you as well, Ms. Buck, you've said Canada is largely reactive in a recent Maclean's piece, and that there hasn't been an overhaul of global affairs since 2005. Do you think reactive is how you would describe what's happening here? What specifically needs to change to improve Canada's position in the world?
Well, everyone's being reactive right now to the increasing piling on of threats from Vladimir Putin. So I'm not faulting Canada there. But overall, I do think that there is less of a culture of valuing diplomacy and less of a culture of trying to forecast what the threats will look like a few years from now and getting ready in advance. Arctic is one example. Right? And less of a culture of reaching out to Canadians to have a national conversation about our international interests, our security threats, and how they're changing. So we've got a long, proud history of diplomacy. Canada's been very good at it. But I fear that we need some more. The world is changing in many, many ways beyond the business that we're worried about with Russia. And I fear that we need to invest more in the people and the networks and the capabilities to keep up.
Ms. Buck, thank you so much for your time and your perspective.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Bye.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.